The weak autumn sun was sinking behind the church steeple when Zachariah Hayes noticed something unusual in the shadows, a huddled figure with what appeared to be a small bundle clutched protectively to her chest. The discovery stopped him in his tracks, boots frozen in the dusty soil of Promise Creek, Colorado, a town that had sprung up around silver mines and cattle drives in 1876. Zachariah Zach, to the folks who knew him, adjusted his weathered Stetson and approached cautiously. He was no stranger to caution. 5 years working his ranch alone had taught him the value of careful movement. At 32, the tall cowboy had seen his share of hardship, from the war that had taken his brother to the harsh winters that threatened his livelihood each year. "Madam," he called softly, not wanting to startle her. "Are you all right?" The woman's head jerked up, revealing a face streaked with dirt and tears. She couldn't have been more than 25, with copper hair tumbling in tangles around her shoulders and eyes the color of prairie sky after a storm. The bundle in her arms moved slightly, and Zach realized it was an infant, no more than a few months old. "Please," she whispered, her voice hoarse, "don't tell anyone I'm here." Zach crouched down, keeping a respectful distance. "I don't mean you any harm. But this isn't a place for you and the little one to spend the night. October nights get mighty cold around these parts." The woman pulled the baby closer. "We'll be fine. I just need to rest, then we'll move on." The baby fussed, a tiny mewling sound that tugged at something long dormant in Zach's chest. He glanced at the darkening sky, then back at the woman's threadbare dress and the thin blanket wrapped around the infant. "There's room at my place," he said simply. "Food, warmth, privacy. No questions asked if that's how you want it." Her eyes narrowed with suspicion. "Why would you help strangers?" "Because my mother raised me better than to leave a woman and child to freeze behind a church." He stood and extended his hand. "Zachariah Hayes. I've got a ranch about 3 miles east of town." She hesitated, then shifted the baby to one arm and placed her free hand in his. It was small, cold, and calloused. "Katherine," she said finally. "Katherine Donovan, and this is Emma." Zach helped her to her feet, noting how she swayed slightly. "When did you last eat, Miss Donovan?" Katherine's gaze dropped. "Yesterday morning." "Then we'd best get you both home for supper." He gestured toward the livery stable at the edge of town. "My horse is this way." They walked in silence, Katherine limping slightly. Zach led them to a sturdy bay gelding waiting patiently at the hitching post. After helping her mount, he handed Emma up carefully, then swung into the saddle behind them. Katherine sat rigid against him, clearly uncomfortable with their proximity. "I'll keep a proper distance once we're at the ranch," he assured her, guiding the horse onto the trail that led east. "But for now, this is the safest way to travel." The sun had fully set by the time they reached Zach's property. The Hayes Ranch wasn't grand, a sturdy log cabin, a small barn, a corral, and about 500 acres of decent grazing land, but it was his, free and clear. "It's not much," he said as they approached, "but it's warm and dry." Katherine surveyed the property with wary eyes. "You live here alone?" "Just me and about 50 head of cattle. And Rufus." At her questioning look, he added, "My dog. He's friendly, especially to folks who might slip him table scraps." Inside, the cabin was simple but well kept. A stone fireplace dominated one wall with a cookstove opposite. A rough-hewn table with 2 chairs sat in the center, and through a doorway, Katherine could see a bedroom with a large bed. Another smaller room, likely a storeroom, was adjacent to it. Zach busied himself lighting the fire and lamps while Katherine stood uncertainly in the doorway, Emma growing fussier in her arms. "The bedroom's yours," Zach said, nodding toward the door. "I'll take a pallet out here." "I couldn't possibly." "You can and you will," he interrupted gently. You need proper rest, and so does that little one." A large brown dog with floppy ears trotted in from the bedroom, eyeing the newcomers with curious interest. "That's Rufus. He won't bother you none." Catherine's shoulders sagged with exhaustion. "Thank you, Mr. Hayes." "Zach," he corrected, turning to the stove. "Now let me fix something to eat. Nothing fancy, but it'll fill your belly." While Zach prepared a simple meal of beans, bacon, and biscuits, Catherine settled in the chair nearest the fire, rocking Emma gently. The baby had quieted somewhat but still fussed. "She's probably hungry," Catherine said, her voice tinged with worry. "I haven't been able to. That is, I haven't had enough to eat myself to." Zach's expression softened with understanding. "There's fresh milk in the cellar from my cow, Bessie." "Not the same as mother's milk, I know, but it might help." He returned moments later with a small clay pitcher. Catherine mixed some with water and used a cloth to let Emma suckle the diluted milk. The baby accepted it eagerly. Over the simple supper, Catherine remained guarded, answering Zach's few questions with minimal responses. She was from St. Louis originally. She'd been traveling west for several weeks. No, there was no husband waiting for her. "You don't have to tell me anything you don't want to," Zach assured her as he cleared their plates. "But you and Emma are welcome to stay as long as you need. Winter's coming, and the trail's no place for a baby." That night, as Catherine lay in Zach's bed with Emma beside her, she stared at the rough-hewn ceiling beams and wondered at the strange twist of fate that had brought her to this cowboy's door. Trust didn't come easily, not anymore, but the alternative was the cold ground and an uncertain future. For tonight, at least, they were safe. The next morning, Catherine woke to sunlight streaming through the cabin's small window and the smell of coffee brewing. Emma was still asleep beside her, making tiny snuffling sounds. For a moment, Catherine forgot where they were, panic seizing her chest until the events of the previous evening came flooding back. In the main room, Zach was already dressed and cooking breakfast, his movements quiet and efficient. "Morning," he said, glancing up as she emerged from the bedroom. "Hope you slept well." "Better than I have in weeks," Catherine admitted, smoothing her wrinkled dress. "I should check on Emma. There's water heating on the stove if you want to wash up, and I put some clean shirts and such on the chair there. They'll be too big, but they're freshly laundered." Catherine felt tears prick her eyes at this simple kindness. "Thank you." After tending to Emma and washing her face and hands, Catherine changed into one of Zach's shirts, tying it at the waist over her skirt. It smelled of lye soap and fresh air. Breakfast was eggs, more biscuits, and strong coffee. Zach ate quickly, explaining he needed to check on a section of fence that had been damaged in the last storm. "Make yourself at home," he said, placing his hat on his head as he headed for the door. "There's plenty of food. I should be back by midday." After he left, Catherine explored the cabin more thoroughly. It was simple but comfortable, with a few books on a shelf, mostly practical volumes about ranching and animal husbandry, but also a worn copy of Ivanhoe and a Bible. Everything was orderly, the mark of a man accustomed to caring for himself. She found a washtub in the lean-to attached to the cabin and decided to bathe Emma, who cooed happily in the warm water. As she dried and dressed her daughter, Catherine spoke softly. "What do you think, little one? Have we found a temporary haven, or should we move on when we're stronger?" Emma responded by grabbing her mother's finger and attempting to pull it to her mouth. "Yes, I know. One day at a time." True to his word, Zach returned around noon, his clothes dusty from work. He paused in the doorway, clearly surprised to find the cabin tidier than he'd left it, with something savory simmering on the stove. "You didn't have to do that," he said, removing his hat. "It seemed the least I could do." Catherine stirred the pot of stew she'd prepared from the supplies in his pantry. I hope you don't mind my using your food. Mind, I can't remember the last time I came home to a cooked meal. He hung his hat on a peg by the door. It smells mighty fine. Over lunch, Zach was more talkative, telling her about his ranch, how he'd acquired it 4 years earlier from an old-timer heading back east, how he was slowly building his herd, how he hoped to add more acreage come spring. What about family? Katherine asked, then immediately regretted the question when his expression grew somber. Lost my parents to influenza back in '68. My brother Daniel didn't come back from the war. He paused. What about you? Anyone looking for you and Emma? Katherine tensed. No, there's no one. Zach nodded, accepting her answer without pressing further. The days fell into an unexpected rhythm. Zach would rise early, tend to essential ranch work, and return to the cabin for the midday meal. Katherine kept the house, prepared food, and cared for Emma. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, sometimes talking, sometimes in comfortable silence. A week passed, then two. October gave way to November, and the first snow dusted the distant mountains. On a crisp morning when Zach was repairing a loose board on the porch, Katherine finally broached the subject they'd been avoiding. I should be moving on soon, she said. Emma balanced on her hip. We've imposed on your kindness long enough. Zach paused, hammer in mid-swing. Where would you go? West, I suppose. California, maybe. It's nearly winter, Katherine. The passes will be snowed in soon if they aren't already. He set down the hammer and turned to face her. Stay until spring. It's safer for both of you. I can't just live here without contributing something. You cook, you clean, you mended my shirts better than I ever could. He gestured toward the cabin. Truth is, this place hasn't felt like a home in a long time, not until you and Emma came along. Katherine felt her cheeks warm. Zach, I'm not asking for anything, he said quickly. Just offering shelter through the winter. Come spring, if you still want to head west, I won't stop you. She studied his face, the honest blue eyes, the strong jaw softened by concern. In the weeks they'd shared his roof, he'd never once made her uncomfortable or asked questions she wasn't ready to answer. All right, she agreed finally. Until spring. That evening, as Zach sat in his chair by the fire, Emma surprised them both by crawling to him and pulling herself up on his knee. He froze, uncertain, until Katherine nodded her permission. Gently, he lifted the baby onto his lap. Well, hello there, Miss Emma, he said, his voice softer than Katherine had ever heard it. Emma responded by patting his face with her tiny hands, clearly fascinated by his stubbled jaw. She likes you, Katherine observed. Smart girl, Zach replied with a grin. Knows who sneaks her extra sugar when her mama isn't looking. Katherine laughed, a genuine, unguarded sound that made Zach's heart skip. It was the first time he'd heard it, and he decided then that he wanted to hear it much more often. As November deepened, so did the cold. The first major snowfall came just before Thanksgiving, blanketing the ranch in white. Zach spent long hours ensuring the cattle had access to feed and water, returning to the cabin with his clothes stiff with ice and his face raw from the wind. On these evenings, Katherine would have hot coffee waiting, and sometimes warm apple cobbler made from the dried apples in his stores. They would sit at the table while Zach thawed, and Katherine would read aloud from one of his books, her voice bringing the stories to life in a way he'd never experienced reading them himself. Emma grew stronger and more active, now pulling herself up on furniture and attempting her first wobbly steps. She had Katherine's copper hair and expressive eyes, but there was something in the set of her jaw that reminded Zach of someone else, someone he couldn't quite place. One evening, as a particularly fierce blizzard howled outside, Katherine sat darning one of Zach's socks while he whittled a small wooden horse. "Is that for Emma?" she asked. He nodded. Thought she might like something to play with. Never made a toy before, so it's not very fancy. It's wonderful. Katherine set aside her mending and moved closer to examine his work. You're quite talented. My father taught me, said a man should know how to use his hands for more than just work. He blew wood shavings from the figure. What about your father? What did he teach you? Katherine was quiet for so long that Zach thought she wouldn't answer. Finally, she said, he taught me to read, and to be cautious of men who make promises they don't intend to keep. Sounds like a wise man. He was. He died when I was 16. Accident at the factory where he worked. I'm sorry, she shrugged. It was a long time ago, and your mother followed him a year later. Broken heart, the doctor said, though I think it was more likely the consumption. Zach set down the carving knife. So you were alone at 17. I had my aunt in St. Louis. She took me in, got me work as a seamstress in a dress shop. Katherine's fingers traced the pattern on the arm of her chair. I was good at it. Might have opened my own shop someday if. When she didn't continue, Zach gently prompted, if. Katherine's gaze moved to Emma, who was sleeping in a makeshift cradle Zach had constructed. If I hadn't met William Donovan. The name hung in the air between them. It was the first time she'd mentioned any man from her past, and Zach sensed they were approaching the reason she'd been sleeping behind a church in a strange town. Emma's father, he asked quietly. Katherine nodded. He was passing through St. Louis on business. At least, that's what he told me. He was handsome, charming, from a good family back east, or so he claimed. Her voice hardened. We were married within a month. By the time I realized he had a wife in Boston and another in New Orleans, I was already carrying Emma. Zach's hands tightened on the armrests of his chair. What happened? When I confronted him, he denied everything at first. Then he laughed. Katherine's eyes grew distant with the memory. Said no judge would believe me over him, and even if they did, what respectable woman would raise a child born of bigamy? He offered me money to take care of the problem and disappear. But you didn't. No, I wanted my baby. So I left St. Louis with what little I had saved and headed west. I thought if I could get far enough away, start fresh somewhere no one knew me. She sighed. I was naive. You were brave, Zach corrected. Still are. Their eyes met across the dim room, firelight dancing in the space between them. Something shifted in that moment, a door opening in Katherine's carefully constructed walls. I've been running for almost a year, she admitted. The money ran out in Denver. I've been working when I could find it, moving when I couldn't. Emma was born in a boarding house in Cheyenne. And Promise Creek, how did you end up there? The stagecoach I was riding had a broken axle just outside of town. I couldn't afford another ticket, so I thought I'd find work for a few days, save enough to move on. She rubbed her temples. But Emma got sick, nothing serious, just a cold, and I spent what little I had on medicine. Then the boarding house owner found out I was behind on rent and put us out. That's when I found you. Yes, Katherine's voice softened. That's when you found us. Zach moved to kneel beside her chair, taking her hand in his. You don't have to run anymore, Katherine, not from here, not from me. She searched his face, looking for any sign of deception or ulterior motive. Finding none, she squeezed his hand. Thank you. That night, long after Katherine had retired to the bedroom, Zach lay on his pallet by the fire, thinking about the story she'd shared. Anger at the man who had deceived her ward, with gratitude that his actions had ultimately brought her to Promise Creek to him. He wasn't fool enough to think she would stay beyond spring. But for now, for these winter months, he could keep her and Emma safe. It would have to be enough. December arrived with more snow and preparations for Christmas. Zach brought in a small pine tree from the north edge of his property, and Katherine decorated it with strings of dried berries and paper stars she'd cut from old newspaper. They hung Emma's tiny socks by the fireplace, and Zach carved more toys: a little wagon, a spinning top, a doll with movable arms. On Christmas Eve, Zach returned from town with supplies and a small package wrapped in brown paper. "What's this?" Katherine asked when he handed it to her. "Just a little something. For tomorrow." She looked troubled. "I don't have anything for you. You've given me plenty," he assured her. "Having you and Emma here is gift enough." Christmas morning dawned clear and cold. They exchanged gifts by the fire. Zach's package contained a soft blue shawl for Katherine and a knitted cap for Emma. Katherine had secretly repaired and polished his father's old pocket watch, which had been sitting broken in a drawer. "How did you?" he began, turning the gleaming timepiece over in his hands. "I noticed it when I was putting away laundry," she explained. "The clockmaker in town showed me how to clean it properly, and it just needed a new spring." Zach stared at the watch, memories of his father flooding back. "This is—" "Thank you, Katherine, truly." She smiled, wrapping the shawl around her shoulders. "You're welcome." They spent the day in quiet celebration, sharing a special meal of roast rabbit and dried apple pie. In the evening, Zach played simple tunes on a harmonica Katherine hadn't known he owned, and they sang carols by the light of the Christmas candles. As Katherine put Emma to bed that night, she realized with a start that this had been the happiest Christmas she could remember. The thought was both comforting and troubling. Comforting because the warmth and safety of Zach's home had begun to heal wounds she hadn't known were still open. Troubling because she knew it couldn't last. January brought the harshest weather of the winter. Bitter cold descended on the ranch, forcing Zach to spend most of his time tending to the cattle, making sure they had access to feed and weren't trapped by drifting snow. He would return to the cabin half frozen, his beard crusted with ice, his hands stiff and red. On these nights, Katherine would help him warm up, rubbing his hands between hers and pressing hot drinks into his palms. Sometimes their fingers would linger together longer than necessary, and a current would pass between them that neither acknowledged aloud. Emma took her first real steps in January, tottering from Katherine to Zach with a look of triumph on her tiny face. Zach caught her as she fell into his arms, swinging her high in the air as she giggled with delight. "She's growing so fast," he observed, settling the baby on his knee. "Too fast," Katherine agreed. "Soon she'll be running circles around us both." "She has your determination," Zach said, bouncing Emma gently. "And your smile." Katherine watched them together, her heart constricting at the easy affection between the cowboy and her daughter. Emma had no memory of her real father, the man who had rejected her, before she was even born, but she would remember Zach's kindness, his patience, his big hands that held her so carefully. That night after Emma was asleep, Katherine found Zach on the porch despite the cold, staring up at the star-filled sky. "You'll freeze out here," she said, wrapping her shawl tighter. "Just thinking." He glanced at her. "You should go back inside where it's warm." Instead, she moved to stand beside him, following his gaze to the stars. "What are you thinking about?" He was quiet for a long moment. "The future, I suppose. Spring will be here before we know it." The reminder of their agreement hung in the air between them. Katherine had promised to stay only until the winter passed. "Yes," she said softly. "It will, Katherine." He turned to face her fully. "I know you plan to move on, but I want you to know that you and Emma are welcome to stay, permanently if you wish." Her breath caught. "What are you saying, Zach?" "I'm saying that I care for you both, more than I thought possible." His voice was steady, but she could see the vulnerability in his eyes. "I'm saying that this cabin feels empty when you're not in it, that Emma's laughter is the best sound I've ever heard, that I want to build a life with you both if you'll have me." Katherine's mind whirled. She couldn't deny the feelings that had grown between them, the comfort of his presence, the way her heart quickened when he smiled at her, the sense of rightness she felt in his home. But the memory of William's betrayal was still raw. "I'm afraid," she admitted. "I trusted once before and was terribly wrong." "I'm not William," Zach said gently. "I won't make promises I can't keep. All I can offer is what I am, a simple rancher with land that needs tending and a heart that's yours if you want it." Katherine looked into his eyes, seeing the honesty there. "I need time, Zach. We have all winter," he replied. "I'm not going anywhere." As January gave way to February, the days grew incrementally longer, though the cold maintained its grip on the land. Katherine watched Zach with new awareness, noting the gentleness with which he treated Emma, the respect he always showed her, the quiet strength that defined him. One evening, as Zach read aloud from Ivanhoe, while Emma played on a quilt by the fire, Katherine realized with sudden clarity that she didn't want to leave when spring came. The thought of returning to a life of uncertainty, of raising Emma alone in strange towns, felt wrong now. This cabin, this man, had become home in a way she hadn't believed possible, but doubt still lingered. Was she simply gravitating toward safety, toward the security Zach offered? Or was there something deeper between them? February brought a brief thaw, allowing Zach to make a trip into town for supplies. He returned with letters that had been held at the general store during the worst of the weather. Among them was a newspaper from Denver, several weeks old. Katherine was preparing supper when she heard Zach's sharp intake of breath as he read. "What is it?" she asked, turning from the stove. Zach held up the paper. "William Donovan. He's been arrested in Denver for fraud and bigamy. Apparently, he's wanted in 3 states. Katherine sank into a chair, her legs suddenly weak. "Arrested? According to this, he'll be spending the next 10 years in prison." Zach set the paper down and knelt beside her chair. "You're safe, Katherine. He can't hurt you or Emma anymore." Tears welled in her eyes, not of sadness, but of relief. For so long she'd looked over her shoulder, fearful that William might find her, might try to take Emma or force Katherine to give up her child. Now that threat was gone. "I never thought." She began, then stopped, overwhelmed. Zach took her hands in his. "You don't have to run anymore. You can choose where to make your home based on what you want, not what you're afraid of." She looked at him, seeing the question in his eyes that he was too respectful to ask aloud. Did this change her plans? Would she still leave in spring? "I need to think," she said quietly. He nodded, rising to his feet. "Take all the time you need." The following week brought another storm, this one accompanied by howling winds that threatened to tear shingles from the roof. Zach spent a miserable day securing the barn and checking on the cattle, returning to the cabin as darkness fell, soaked and exhausted. Katherine had water heating for a bath and helped him peel off his frozen outer layers. As she reached to help him with his shirt buttons, their eyes met, and something electric passed between them. Her fingers stilled on the button, and for a heartbeat, neither moved. Then Emma called from the bedroom, breaking the spell. Katherine stepped back, her cheeks flushed. "I'll see to her," she murmured, hurrying away. Later that night, long after Emma was asleep and Zach had settled on his pallet by the dying fire, Katherine lay awake in his bed, thinking about that moment. The look in his eyes had been unmistakable desire, yes, but also a depth of feeling that both thrilled and terrified her. She had come to care for him deeply. That much she could no longer deny. His steadiness, his quiet strength, the way he treated Emma as if she were his own, all of it had worn away at the walls she'd built around her heart. But was it enough? Could she trust again, not just with her own heart but with Emma's future? The answer came to her in the darkest hour of night, as the storm raged outside and the cabin creaked in the wind. She remembered how Zach had found her behind the church, offering shelter without hesitation. How he'd respected her privacy, never pushing for information she wasn't ready to give. How he'd carved toys for Emma and taught Katherine to ride his gentle mare and listened to her read aloud with such attention. Most of all, she remembered his words on the porch. All I can offer is what I am. And what he was, she realized, was everything she could want in a partner, in a father for Emma. Honest, kind, hardworking, steadfast. Katherine slipped from the bed, careful not to wake Emma. The floor was cold beneath her bare feet as she made her way to the main room. The fire had burned down to embers, casting just enough light to see Zach's form on the pallet. "Zach," she whispered. He was instantly alert, sitting up. "Katherine, is something wrong?" She knelt beside his pallet. "No, nothing's wrong. I've been thinking about what you said about staying." Even in the dim light, she could see the hope that kindled in his eyes. "And I want to stay. With you. I want Emma to grow up here with both of us." Zach reached out, his hand cupping her cheek. "Are you certain?" Katherine leaned into his touch. "I've never been more certain of anything." "I love you, Zachariah Hayes." "And I love you, Katherine Donovan." Their first kiss was gentle, tentative, like a question and an answer all at once. When they parted, Katherine rested her forehead against his. "I should go back to Emma," she said softly. Zach nodded, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "We have time. All the time in the world." As February turned to March, the snow began to recede, revealing patches of muddy earth beneath. The cattle grew restless, eager for fresh grass, and new calves wobbled on spindly legs in the warming sun. Katherine and Zach moved through their days with a new awareness of each other, stealing kisses when Emma was napping, holding hands as they walked the property, making plans for the future in quiet evening conversations. "We should be properly married," Zach said one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. "Before the spring roundup begins, if you're ready." Katherine smiled. "I'm ready." They were married in the small church in Promise Creek on the first truly warm day of spring. The ceremony was simple, attended by a handful of Zach's neighbors and friends from town. Emma, now toddling confidently, scattered wildflower petals with more enthusiasm than accuracy. Katherine wore a new dress of pale blue, sewn by her own hands from fabric Zach had brought from Denver. Zach wore his best shirt and a new vest, his hair freshly trimmed, his face clean-shaven for the occasion. As they spoke their vows, Katherine thought of the journey that had brought her to this moment, the heartbreak and fear, the long months of uncertainty, the night Zach had found her behind this very church. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the preacher declared, and Zach kissed her with a tenderness that brought tears to her eyes. That evening, after the small celebration had ended and they had returned to the ranch, their ranch now, Zach carried Emma to her new bed in what had once been the storeroom, now transformed into a snug nursery. "Sleep tight, little one," he whispered, kissing her forehead. "Papa loves you." The words sent a surge of emotion through Katherine. Emma would grow up with a father who chose her, who loved her not out of obligation but out of the goodness of his heart. Later, as they lay together in the darkness of their bedroom, Katherine traced the contours of Zach's face with her fingertips. "Thank you," she said softly. "For what? For finding us. For giving us a home." He captured her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm. "You gave me something far greater. A family." As spring bloomed across the ranch, bringing new life and color to the land, Katherine found herself blooming too. The fear that had driven her for so long faded like winter frost in the sun, replaced by a deep contentment she had never known was possible. Emma thrived, growing strong on fresh milk and eggs, spending her days exploring the ranch under the watchful eyes of her parents and Rufus, who had appointed himself her personal guardian. Zach expanded the garden, building a picket fence around it to keep out rabbits, and Katherine planted vegetables and herbs, along with flowers that reminded her of her mother's garden from her childhood. In late April, Katherine received a letter from the Denver authorities, informing her that William Donovan had begun serving his sentence and asking if she wished to make any additional claims against him. After discussing it with Zach, she replied that she wanted nothing more to do with the man who had deceived her. William Donovan belonged to her past. Her future was here, with the family she and Zach were building. Summer arrived with long, warm days of hard work and simple pleasures. Zach taught Katherine to ride properly, and soon she was helping with the easier ranch tasks. Emma secured in a carrier on her back, giggling at the motion of the horse beneath them. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains gold and purple. Sometimes Zach would play his harmonica, the sweet, mournful notes drifting across the land. Other times they would simply talk, sharing dreams for the future, plans for the ranch, hopes for Emma. "I want more children," Katherine admitted one such evening. "Brothers and sisters for Emma." Zach's face lit with joy. "Nothing would make me happier." As if the universe had been listening, Katherine discovered in late summer that their wish was already coming true. The baby would arrive in early spring, the doctor in town confirmed. "A spring baby," Zach said, his hand resting gently on her still flat stomach. "Perfect timing." The news spread quickly through the small community, bringing visits from neighbors bearing gifts and advice. Katherine found herself welcomed not as an outsider or a woman with a mysterious past, but as Mrs. Hayes, Zach's wife, Emma's mother, a respected member of the community. Autumn painted the landscape in golds and reds, and Katherine prepared the cabin for another winter, her second at the Hayes Ranch, but the first she faced without fear. They harvested the garden, preserved fruits and vegetables, smoked meat, and stacked firewood high against the cabin walls. Emma's second birthday came in October, celebrated with a small cake and the gift of a rocking horse Zach had been secretly crafting for months. Her copper curls had grown longer, her blue eyes brighter, and her vocabulary expanded daily, much to her parents' delight. "Mama, Papa, look," became her favorite phrase, usually followed by some small wonder she had discovered: a colorful leaf, an interesting rock, a butterfly resting on a fence post. One crisp afternoon, as Katherine hung laundry on the line while Emma played nearby, she spotted a stagecoach approaching on the road that ran past their property. It was unusual the regular stage didn't come this way, and she shaded her eyes to get a better look. The coach stopped at their gate, and a well-dressed woman descended, speaking briefly to the driver before approaching the cabin. Katherine gathered Emma into her arms, suddenly wary. "Mrs. Hayes," the woman called, stopping a respectful distance away. "Katherine Hayes." "Yes," Katherine replied cautiously. "Can I help you?" The woman removed her gloves. "My name is Eleanor Donovan. I believe you knew my brother William." Katherine's heart hammered in her chest. "What do you want?" "To apologize," Eleanor said simply. "And to give you something that is rightfully yours." From her handbag, she withdrew an envelope. "William's actions have brought shame to our family. When I learned of his multiple marriages and the children he abandoned, I knew I had to try to make amends, however inadequately." Katherine stared at the envelope. "I want nothing from the Donovans. I understand." Eleanor's gaze moved to Emma. "She has his eyes, our father's eyes, actually." "She has her own eyes," Katherine said firmly, "and a father who loves her." Eleanor nodded. "I've heard that you've remarried." "I'm glad, But please, take this. She extended the envelope again. It's Emma's birthright, a trust fund from our father's estate. William had no right to keep it from her. Before Katherine could respond, Zach rode up, having spotted the stagecoach from the north pasture. He dismounted quickly, moving to stand beside Katherine and Emma. "Everything all right here?" he asked, his voice calm but his posture protective. Katherine introduced a leaner, explaining her connection to William. Zach's expression remained neutral, but she could feel the tension in him. "Mrs. Donovan was just leaving," Katherine said. "Please consider the trust fund," Alina persisted. "It doesn't come from William. It's from our father's estate, money that would have gone to William's legitimate children. Emma is his daughter, regardless of the circumstances." Zach and Katherine exchanged a look. After a moment, Katherine accepted the envelope. "Thank you for coming all this way," she said, "but Emma has everything she needs here." Alina smiled sadly. "I can see that she does. I won't trouble you further." After she had gone, Zach and Katherine sat on the porch steps, the unopened envelope between them. "What do you want to do?" Zach asked. Katherine considered the question. "Part of me wants to burn it, to erase every connection to that man. And the other part thinks it might be good for Emma to have something for her future. For school, perhaps, or to start her own business someday." Zach nodded. "It's your decision. Whatever you choose, I'll support." In the end, they decided to place the money in a bank account in Emma's name, to be accessed when she turned 21. It wasn't about William, Katherine reasoned, but about giving their daughter options they had never had. "She'll know that you're her father," Katherine assured Zach that night as they lay in bed. "The only father that matters." He pulled her close, his hand resting protectively over the gentle swell of her stomach where their second child grew. "We're a family, Katherine. Nothing and no one can change that." Winter returned to the ranch, bringing snow and cold winds but none of the fear and uncertainty of the previous year. The cabin was warm and secure, filled with the sounds of Emma's chatter, Zach's deep laugh, Katherine's singing as she worked. Christmas was a joyous celebration, with a larger tree than the previous year and more gifts beneath it. Zach had expanded the cabin, adding another bedroom and enlarging the main room to accommodate their growing family. As they sat by the fire on Christmas Eve, Emma sleeping on a quilt nearby, Zach took Katherine's hand. "Happy?" he asked. Katherine looked around the cabin at the home they had built together, at her daughter sleeping peacefully, at the man who had changed her life with 6 simple words. "There's room at my place." "More than I ever thought possible," she answered truthfully. Outside, snow fell softly, covering the land in a blanket of white. Inside, the fire crackled, casting golden light over the family gathered in its warmth. Katherine Hayes, once a desperate woman sleeping behind a church with a baby in her arms, had found not just shelter but love, not just safety but belonging. Spring would come again, bringing with it a new life to add to their family. Summer would follow, and autumn, and winter once more. Seasons turning, children growing, love deepening with each passing day. The wild frontier that had once seemed so threatening had become home, and the cowboy who had offered shelter on a cold autumn evening had become the center of her world. Life was good on the Hayes Ranch, not always easy, but always worth it. And when the winds blew cold and the night grew dark, they had each other. A family forged not by blood but by choice, by love, by the simple magic of finding room in one's heart for another. And that, Katherine knew, was the greatest blessing of all.